I mean, usually when we talk about ancient myths, there is this underlying expectation of human imagination.
Right.
We tend to picture early humans just sitting around a campfire, looking up at a terrifying, unpredictable night sky and just, making up stories to explain a world they didn't understand.
Yeah, exactly.
And honestly, that idea is comforting. It puts a neat little bow on history. It implies that, well, we are the smart ones now. We have science and telescopes, and they only had campfire tales.
Right. It acts as a buffer. It places modern humanity at the very top of the intellectual evolutionary ladder.
Yeah, exactly.
The assumption is simply that early humans had psychological coping mechanisms, which we call mythology, and we have empirical reality.
But then you step into the world of comparative mythology, specifically looking at a stack of research we have on the table today from William J. Oxfield.
Which is fascinating.
It really is. And suddenly that comforting campfire story starts to feel a lot more like a police interrogation room. Because in today's deep dive, we are exploring a genuinely mind-bending question.
Yeah, a big one.
What if the ancient myths you've always been told were just psychological archetypes or, like, localized folklore are actually fragmented, highly accurate historical records of a literal cosmic transgression?
I mean, it completely flips the paradigm.
It does.
We are looking at traditions from entirely disconnected cultures across the globe that all suggest the same terrifying sequence.
Right.
A pre-flood era where sky beings descended, transferred forbidden knowledge to humans, bred a hybrid generation of giants, and were ultimately punished by a catastrophic reset of the Earth.
Which is a lot to take in.
It is. And as we'll see, standard academic theories simply fail to explain the extreme specificity of these shared global memories.
Which is our mission for today. We're going to take Oxfield's data and look at isolated cultures as a global crime scene.
I love that analogy.
Right. Think about how you would handle an investigation. If you have two witnesses sitting in the same room and they give you the exact same story, well, you assume they colluded.
Yeah, they got their stories straight. Exactly. But if you have two people on opposite sides of the planet, locked in solitary confinement for millennia, and they recount the exact same impossibly specific details.
You are forced to consider that what they saw actually happened.
Exactly.
And that locked room investigation is the perfect lens for this. Because to understand why Oxfield's premise is so disruptive, we first have to understand how academics usually explain away matching stories across the globe.
Right, the standard playbook.
Yeah. They generally rely on two standard mechanisms. The first is cultural diffusion. This is the simple idea that stories spread through physical contact, trade rates, migration, conquering armies.
Right.
A story starts in Mesopotamia, travels along the Silk Road, and slowly mutates as it moves east.
It's kind of the ancient equivalent of a viral tweet.
That's a good way to put it.
And the second standard explanation, looking at Oxfield's notes here, is Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious.
Right, that's the psychological safety net. Jung argued that all human brains share the exact same underlying psychological architecture.
Meaning we all think the same way deep down.
Exactly. Because our brains are wired the same way, we independently generate the same narrative archetypes no matter where we are. We all fear the dark, so we all invent monsters that hide in the shadows.
And we all appreciate the sun, so we invent sun gods.
Precisely.
I'll admit, both of those explanations sound completely reasonable on the surface, but Oxfield argues they fall completely short when applied to the actual texts. So let's dig into why.
The fatal flaw in the psychological argument is that it fails to distinguish between structural parallels and textual parallels.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, Jung's collective unconscious is brilliant at explaining structural parallels. A generic hero going on a journey, a generic skyfather, or, a generic catastrophic flood.
Because shared human psychology absolutely produces those broad strokes.
Yeah, but Jung cannot explain textual parallels. These are specific, entirely unnecessary procedural details that appear in multiple independent accounts.
Let me push back on that a little bit, specifically regarding the flood myths. I can see someone arguing that every early agricultural society built their cities on riverbanks.
Yes.
The Tigris, the Euphrates, the Yellow River. Rivers flood, sometimes catastrophically. It's a universal human trauma. So naturally, every ancient culture writes a flood story to process that trauma.
That makes sense.
Right. Why do we need a supernatural explanation for river flooding?
That is the textbook counterargument, and it makes logical sense until you read the actual source material.
Okay.
Yes, the fear of catastrophic water is universal. but universal river floods do not independently produce the exact same bizarre narrative of divine warning. An enclosed wooden vessel, exactly 8 survivors, and a highly specific sequential release of birds to test the waters.
The birds, yeah. Oxfield highlights this as the ultimate smoking gun for textual parallels.
Because there is zero psychological necessity in the bird sequence. Think about practical survival. If you are surviving a flood in a boat, you don't need a sequential release of different bird species to tell a psychologically satisfying story.
No, you could just have the hero look out the window and see the tops of mountains.
Exactly. But in the Hebrew book of Genesis, Noah releases a raven, which flies back and forth. Then he releases a dove, which returns. He waits 7 days, releases the dove again, and it brings back an olive branch.
Right.
Now look at the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, which predates Genesis by centuries. The survivor, Utnapishtim, releases a dove, then a swallow, then a raven.
So the bird order is slightly shuffled, but the actual procedure testing the habitability of the Earth via sequential bird release is identical.
Identical. And that level of textual specificity requires a shared source. It requires a transmitted memory of an actual event, not just a shared psychological fear of water.
Right.
Jung's theories simply cannot account for matching procedural checklists.
Which logically forces us back to the other academic explanation, cultural diffusion.
Right.
Because if the details are too specific to be coincidence, then the Sumerians must have just told the story to the Hebrews over a campfire, or vice versa.
Yeah, that would be the assumption.
But Oxfield's research demands that we test this using scientific control groups. We need places where ancient trade routes absolutely did not exist, places totally immune to cultural diffusion.
We need our solitary confinement cells.
Exactly. And the ultimate locked room on planet Earth is Australia.
Oh, absolutely.
The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians arrived roughly 50,000 years ago. After that initial crossing, the continent was geographically isolated. You didn't have Mesopotamian flood epics arriving in the Kimberley region on trading ships.
No.
You didn't have Hebrew scribes wandering the outback.
And yet, looking at the data from that total isolation, they preserved the tradition of Wandjina.
Yes, this is where it gets really interesting.
According to Oxfield's collection of Aboriginal oral histories, these are the supreme creator beings of the Kimberley region in northwestern Australia.
And the tradition explicitly states these were sky beings, right? Spirits of the clouds who came down from the Milky Way.
Yes. They descended, shaped the landscape, taught laws to humanity, and lived among the people.
But notice how their time on Earth ends, though. It is staggering.
It really is.
When their work was done, the Wandjina didn't just fly back into space. The oral tradition insists they painted their own images on rock walls and then descended into specific water holes.
Yeah, they dwell there right now, underground, beneath the earth, present but hidden, still controlling the weather from below.
And Oxfield maps this directly onto the ancient Near East texts. If you open the Book of Enoch, a Jewish text from a completely different hemisphere, you see the exact same sequence.
The exact same.
The Watchers descend from heaven, they teach humanity specific arts, they cross boundaries, and their ultimate punishment is being bound and imprisoned beneath the earth.
It's the same architectural sequence of events preserved by people who never met.
And look at how the Aboriginal people visually depict these beings. The rock art of the Wandjina is completely unique in human history.
Whoa, the visuals are striking.
They are painted with white faces, massive non-human black eyes representing storm clouds, halos or helmets around their heads, and crucially, no mouths.
No mouths. Because the specific theological rule is that if they had mouths and could speak, the rain would never cease.
Wow.
They are explicitly understood and painted as non-human intelligences. And Oxfield points out it's not just the Kimberley region.
Right, there's more.
Across southeastern Australia, a totally different isolated area, you find Baiame, the supreme sky father. He descended, taught the first laws, and then returned to the spirit realm. But the key detail is a strict prohibition.
And what's that?
Baiame's name is forbidden to be spoken publicly.
Which is a precise theological parallel to the Hebrew tradition of the Tetragrammaton, right? The four-letter name of God, YHWH.
Exactly. In ancient Hebrew theology, the divine name is considered so intrinsically powerful, so sacred, that to reduce it to ordinary human speech is a severe transgression.
And you cannot possibly get that highly specific theological mechanism from cultural diffusion when there has been 50 millennia of oceanic isolation.
It's just not possible.
Now, I know the immediate skepticism here. People hear like oral tradition, and they think of the childhood game of telephone.
Oh, sure.
You whisper a word in a circle, and by the end, it's complete gibberish. How could an oral tradition accurately preserve a historical memory for 50,000 years without drifting into pure fantasy?
That is the standard secular assumption, that oral history is inherently unreliable, but modern geology has actually proven that assumption wrong.
Wait, really? Geology?
Yeah. Geologists studied Aboriginal Dreamtime stories regarding the formation of 3 volcanic lakes in Queensland: Lake Seacham, Barine, and Uramo. The oral traditions describe the explosive formation of these craters perfectly. They even note that the surrounding area was a eucalyptus forest at the time the sky beings tore the earth open, not the dense rainforest that has been there for millennia.
When geologists took core samples of the lake beds, the pollen records proved the oral tradition was exactly right.
Spot on.
The event happened over 10,000 years ago.
That is over 400 human generations. The mechanism here isn't casual campfire storytelling. Ancient oral traditions were rigidly enforced, ritualized memorization.
Like a single misplaced word could invalidate the ritual.
Exactly. If an isolated culture can accurately preserve 10,000-year-old geology and paleobotany without drifting into fantasy, well, we are intellectually obligated to take their theological history seriously.
Australia is the ultimate locked room, but Oxkill brings up China as well.
Yes.
Completely isolated from Western religious thought until the Silk Road opened around 130 BC. And the oldest recoverable layer of Chinese religion, it centers on Shangdi.
A single invisible creator god who cannot be represented by any idol or image.
It perfectly matches the concept of pre-Babel monotheism. The idea from the ancient Near East that before humanity fractured into different languages and pagan pantheons, there was a universally recognized singular creator.
So we have our witnesses in solitary confinement, and their testimonies are aligning perfectly.
Which brings us to the actual actions of these beings. When these sky beings descended, what was their objective?
Right, what did they actually do?
Because across all of these isolated cultures, the narrative always centers on one event: the transfer of highly specific, forbidden knowledge.
Looking at the Book of Enoch again, the text lists 200 watchers who descend, and they bring a very specific curriculum.
Yeah, Azazel teaches metallurgy, specifically for forging swords and shields, but he also teaches cosmetics and ornamentation.
Other watchers teach astrology, the cutting of roots, and enchantments.
Now, cross the Eurasian landmass to pre-Silk Road China, and the earliest layer of Chinese mythology speaks of the 3 sovereigns.
These were semi-divine beings who descended to a pre-civilizational humanity.
And the curriculum they taught: agriculture, medicine, writing, astronomy, and metallurgy.
It's the exact same list.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
Any developing culture is eventually going to invent metallurgy to make tools. They are going to look up at the stars and invent astronomy for navigation. They're going to figure out how to make medicine from local plants.
Sure.
Isn't this just the standard technology tree for building a civilization? Why does the origin have to be supernatural?
It is a totally fair question. The necessity of these technologies isn't the mystery. The mystery is the mythological framing.
How do you mean?
Why do entirely disconnected cultures agree that this foundational knowledge was not the result of human ingenuity? Why do they consistently strip humanity of the credit, insisting the knowledge was transferred by non-human intelligences?
That is a weird thing to lie about.
Right. And crucially, why is this transfer so consistently framed as a tragic boundary crossing that corrupts the earth?
Ah, I see. In the Enochian tradition, teaching humanity how to forge weapons and alter their appearance is the exact catalyst that brings divine judgment.
Exactly.
And looking at Oxfield's notes, this brings us to one of the strangest parallels: the Islamic and Sufi tradition of Iblis, also known as Azazel.
The Sufi tradition contains a remarkable narrative about his fall. Before his rebellion, Azazel was known as the peacock of the angels, the most exalted, most beautiful being in the celestial hierarchy.
Okay.
The tradition says that in order to enter the garden and corrupt humanity, he didn't use brute force. He approached the literal peacock guarding the garden and appealed to its vanity.
He promised the bird that its stunning physical beauty would never decay if it helped him.
Right.
So vanity becomes the ultimate vector for cosmic corruption, pride exploiting pride.
Notice how perfectly that maps onto the Enochian watcher Azazel. Azazel's very first crime wasn't teaching men how to wage war. It was teaching women cosmetics.
The use of antimony for the eyes, the unnatural enhancement of physical appearance.
Both traditions, sharing ancient Near East origins, pinpoint the desire for beauty and the manipulation of the created order as the original boundary crossing.
So we have the descent and we have the forbidden knowledge. But this unnatural transfer of knowledge always leads to the exact same consequence.
It triggers an era of giants, which then forces a catastrophic flood to reset the world.
The Age of Giants concept is remarkably ubiquitous across isolated regions. You have the Hebrew Nephilim, the Greek Titans, the Norse Jotnar.
In Mesoamerica, the Maya recorded the Kinemetsen.
Right.
In the Islamic tradition, you have the historical people of Ad, described as a nation of extraordinary stature destroyed by a divine wind.
And Oxfield even points to archaeological evidence in China, specifically at the Geologically excavation site.
Yes. Excavations at a 5,000-year-old site in Shandong province uncovered graves with male skeletal remains averaging 6 feet 3 inches in height.
Wow.
Now, maintaining strict impartiality here, as the author does, a 6'3" skeleton does not explicitly prove a supernatural Nephilim hybrid.
Sure.
But for a population 5,000 years ago, existing well before modern nutritional standards and agriculture, 6 feet 3 is a massive statistical anomaly.
It provides physical data that perfectly aligns with the global memory of anomalously large pre-flood inhabitants.
Exactly.
And this era of corruption is always followed by the reset. In China, you have the floods of Nua and Yu. In Australia, the Worora Flood.
The sequence is identical to Genesis. Divine beings cause a catastrophic inundation to destroy a corrupted world, and the specific survivors are commissioned to repopulate and form a new civilizational order.
It's important to understand this isn't just a weather event. It's a morally structured cosmic event.
Right.
Let's use an analogy here. It's like grading essays. If I have two students who hand in a paper about the Roman Empire, that's just a structural parallel. They both took the same class. They share the same psychological architecture.
Right, but what if they both have the exact same misspelled word in paragraph 3 and the exact same bizarre fabricated footnote at the bottom?
Then somebody copied off the other. Or they both copy from a master source document. We have physical anomalies buried in the dirt. But Oxfield's research doesn't stop at archaeology. He asks if there are historical anomalies recorded in the sky during the same windows.
He highlights a fascinating, precise textual anomaly from the Han Dynasty. Between the years 31 and 33 AD, the official Chinese historical record noted an eclipse.
Which happens to be the exact window scholars debate for the crucifixion of Jesus in the Middle East.
And the official notation in the Chinese imperial record reads, "The sins of all the people are now on one man. Pardon is proclaimed to all under heaven."
That is chilling.
Again, we have to frame this impartially. This language may simply be standard imperial boilerplate. Chinese emperors traditionally took ritual responsibility for cosmic omens.
Like an eclipse meant the emperor needed to repent.
Exactly. But the linguistic precision mapping so flawlessly onto the central claim of Christianity occurring in the exact same historical window inside a totally isolated civilization. It is stunning data to process.
So we have to ask the ultimate question. If all these cultures, the Hebrews, the Chinese, the Maya, the Aboriginal Australians, if they are remembering the exact same literal events, why are the names different?
Right.
Why is the reset sometimes a flood, sometimes ice, and sometimes a divine wind?
This is where Oxfield introduces the Babel scattering mechanism. Imagine a unified post-catastrophe population that shares a single common memory of these cosmic events.
Okay.
Suddenly, this population is geographically dispersed. They scatter across the globe.
And as they scatter, linguistic drift sets in.
Exactly. Thousands of years pass. The original language fragments. The cultural vocabulary shifts to match their new environments.
Ah, I see.
If a tribe moves into a freezing climate, the memory of a catastrophic reset might shift from a flood to an ice age. But the structural skeleton, the divine judgment, the survival of select few, survives the linguistic drift.
So the Watchers of the Near East become the Sumerian Apkallu or the Hindu Asuras.
Right, and Noah becomes the Hindu Manu, the Greek Deucalion, or the Zoroastrian Yima.
I want to look at a specific example of this from Oxfield's notes regarding the Yazidi versus Islamic split over the peacock angel.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
If they share the exact same memory, how do they arrive at completely opposite theological conclusions?
Well, divergence is actually the ultimate proof of a real historical event. Independent mythmakers wouldn't invent the exact same characters in the exact same region just to have a theological debate.
Right.
Look at the core event. A supreme supernatural being refuses to bow before the first human. Islam views Iblis's refusal as the ultimate sin of pride and arrogance.
But the Yazidi tradition views the peacock angel's refusal as an act of supreme loyalty to God's original command to bow to no one else.
So they agree on the event, but disagree on the motive.
Think about how you would act if you witnessed a traffic accident. You and two other people on the corner see the exact same cars crash at an intersection.
Yeah.
You all agree on the structural reality. A red car hit a blue car. But when the police separate you and take your statements, you build entirely different moral frameworks around who was at fault based on your vantage point.
The convergence of the story tells you they all saw the same crash. The divergence of the moral framing tells you they're actual witnesses, not just people repeating a script.
Bringing all of this together, from the mouthless Wandjina painted in the isolated caves of Australia, to the Chinese three sovereigns teaching metallurgy, to the giant Queen Ametsin of the Maya.
That's incredible.
The evidence we've covered today suggests that humanity's wildly diverse religions are not just psychological manifestations. They aren't just a shared fear of the dark or river floods.
No.
They appear to be fragmented witnesses to a shared historical reality, a real, literal cosmic transgression.
A transgression that resulted in a transfer of forbidden knowledge, an era of corrupted hybrid beings, and a divine reset of the entire global system.
This reframes our entire understanding of human history. Next time you read an ancient myth, you shouldn't just ask what it symbolizes. You should be asking what it remembers.
It changes mythology from fiction to investigative journalism.
But there is one final, incredibly unsettling detail that Oxfield points out across all of these Watcher traditions, and it brings us right back to our global crime scene.
The fate of the perpetrators.
The sky beings. Whether we are talking about the Greek titans locked in the abyssal prison of Tartarus, or the Watchers bound beneath the desert, or the Wandjina descending into the underground water holes of the Australian outback, they were not destroyed.
No, they were.
Every single isolated culture agrees on this terrifying point. They were bound and they were imprisoned. They are still present beneath the earth, waiting for their sentence to end.
A suspended sentence hovering over humanity.
So we leave you with this thought to explore on your own. If every geographically isolated culture accurately remembered the transgression, accurately remembered the catastrophic flood, and accurately remembered the prison, what happens when that ancient sentence finally expires?